The aim would be intimidation. I don't see any real look. Venezuela has, a well-trained military. They have militia numbering in the millions, and it makes no difference how many vessels we have stationed off Venezuela's coast. We won't be able to deploy or disembark hundreds of thousands of Marines or troops from these vessels. We're looking at several thousand Marine combat personnel available. So I believe it's mainly intimidation. There is substantial strike capacity inherent in these vessels. So, we could attempt to launch some kind of decapitation operation or an effort to neutralize Venezuela's, armed forces in support of a coup that the CIA might be orchestrating. But primarily, it's pure intimidation. Yes, we are looking at significant money, probably hundreds of millions of dollars. For the time being, we'll see what transpires, how long they remain there. But it is a considerable expense. And the operation with Venezuela was not a pre-planned expenditure, so it comes from an operational budget. That's already strained by our naval forces deployed in the Middle East, our European deployments, our Pacific deployments. So, this is a burden on the defense budget, and it is U.S. taxpayer funds. And one must question, why do we have the U.S. Navy positioned off of the shores of a foreign nation when the United States Congress hasn't determined there to be a threat warranting war? What legitimate, moral, legal, military objective would there be for these vessels and their support personnel to engage? Nothing legitimate. This would be an unlawful war of aggression that we would be conducting against Venezuela based upon a fabricated, pretext. The Venezuela narcotics pretext is, the contemporary equivalent of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction pretext, non-existent threats, manufactured simply to provide a president with political cover for executing a war of aggression, a war of choice. We have no need to go to war with Venezuela. Venezuela does not present a threat against the United States or our partners. So this is simply a war of choice. And because there is no, foundation in international law, indeed, there's no constitutional basis for what the president's preparing to do. It renders it essentially an illegal war of aggression. Earlier today, the president stated in one of his, spontaneous shoot from the hip statements that he might pursue negotiations with Maduro. Well, first of all, they don't recognize Maduro as valid. Marco Rubio doesn't recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. But what is there for them to negotiate? Well, I mean, again, we return to when we discussed the fleet off the coast. Pure intimidation. I believe the negotiation would be something along the lines of Maduro should depart Venezuela and permit the United States to install a government in his place and to prevent bloodshed, to prevent the violence. I believe this would be what the United States going into negotiation would propose. No. First of all, NATO cannot wage a wider war. There's no military capability to conduct such a war. This is about political theater by leadership in the NATO alliance for their domestic constituencies to rationalize increased defense expenditure. So they discuss, first of all, any rhetoric that emerges from NATO mentions a war by 2029, 2030. It's 2025, soon to be 2026, but several years away. So we're not discussing anything that's practical or tangible. We're discussing theory, which indicates that it's not serious. You don't articulate a threat and then state, well, we're going to address this threat in 5 years. That indicates it's not a threat. So this is just pure political posturing of the most absurd kind. There may be advanced teams. There might be, a small number of personnel going in to conduct, advanced force preparations, reconnaissance out locations where theoretically they could position troops. But nobody in NATO is discussing deploying troops in right now. All of the scenarios indicate that, we will deploy troops into Ukraine once a ceasefire has been reached. But even then, there's a substantial caveat because Europe won't deploy troops into Ukraine without American support, and America won't provide this. So this is, purely a politicized, deployment of a small number of troops who will be conducting the kind of advanced preparation, work, reconnaissance, potential locations, identifying communication lines, and things of that nature that would enable planning to occur. But Europe isn't going to deploy a single soldier into a single combat unit into Ukraine until there's a ceasefire. And Russia's already stated there won't be any ceasefire. I mean, realistically, yes, accusations are directed at him. But again, as long as the European powers that support him want him to be continue to be the president of Ukraine snorts laughter, these corruption accusations aren't going to attach to him. That's why they're apprehending the Minister of Justice, or I believe it's Energy, and the Minister of Justice, clears throat. Zelensky is the Teflon president at this point. The moment the accusations stick is the moment you understand that Europe has declared enough. He's finished. There's no question that genuine intelligence experts, and I do believe Europe does have some, are communicating back through their networks about the actuality of the circumstances on the ground. But understand that Europe is being heavily politicized in relation to Ukraine. The British are executing one of the most extensive information warfare campaigns as we speak, designed to maintain Ukraine in the conflict. And a key element of that is to downplay Russian advances and emphasize the capability of Ukraine to sustain defense, therefore justifying the continued allocation of European resources into Ukraine. But you're beginning to observe the European media, accepting reality. There, a gentleman who contributes to DLT, I believe, a German journalist who has been very pro-Ukrainian and very anti-Russian, has published an article today about how, Ukraine is finished, that Russia's offensive. Tusk is, going to collapse within weeks. He's transitioned from being a rabid anti-Russian voice to almost a pessimistic voice. Which indicates that he's reflecting back and stating, look, the Europeans have invested billions and billions of dollars into Ukraine. Despite commitments made by the Trump administration, there's no sign that the funding is being restored, and therefore the economy, the Europeans continue to struggle. German economy is deteriorating. The French economy deteriorating. England's economy is struggling. European leadership are stating, we've invested all this money. We're creating discord within our populations. When we inform them, we're going to allocate more money on defense that, the average European economy, personal household economy is not improving, and yet Ukraine is losing. And so they're questioning themselves, what is there to be achieved from continuing this? And that's the type of position where reality is establishing itself. But there's still a considerable amount of rhetoric and propaganda out there that continues to obscure the reality. It's not being considered seriously, but it's complex. I believe that Donald Trump has an emotional investment in the Alaska momentum. I believe that he was, quite surprised, or not surprised, but quite satisfied with the fact that Ukraine had consented to hear Vladimir Putin's conditions when the two of them finally convened in Alaska. And I believe he thought that, he was going to be, the deal maker. But something occurred or following Alaska in Europe. The Europeans determined that, any Russia approaching the table with preconditions, especially demands that the Minsk agreements be enacted, which indicates that Ukraine, would maintain parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that the Russians have controlled. That Crimea would revert to Ukraine. These preconditions are impossibilities for Putin to accept. And so it appears that Europe may have informed, the Trump administration, look, we're not supportive of Alaska. And once Europe withdraws, the Trump administration cannot maintain its position alone, especially given the divided position in Congress. The Republicans are becoming frustrated with allocating money on Ukraine. Democrats have consistently supported, but within constraints. And so if Europe's not participating, then the American political momentum dissolves. And so I believe Trump is suddenly finding himself understanding that, he doesn't possess the leverage he assumed he had. Marco Rubio, on the other hand, was never supportive of Alaska. Marco Rubio embodies the voice of, traditional American, anti-Russian strategy. That's, it's completely invested in Ukraine, and it's entirely about confronting Russia. So Trump and Rubio are not aligned here. I believe it's both. I believe that Vladimir Putin understands that, ultimately, Russia's going to need to negotiate a resolution with the West. And he'd prefer to negotiate from a position of strength following having accomplished all of Russia's objectives than, negotiate, halfway through where, you're required to make compromises you shouldn't need to make. So I believe he's establishing markers for the post-conflict reality. But I also believe he's revealing hypocrisy, and he's challenging the bluff of those in the West who profess to desire peace. Donald Trump campaigned on delivering peace to Ukraine within 24 hours. Well, it's been, hundreds of days now. There's no peace. Donald Trump had his Alaska momentum. Vladimir Putin appeared, and now Donald Trump has withdrawn from Alaska. So who's genuinely not serious about peace? Is it Putin? No, Putin made an offer. He appeared to a meeting. The West didn't accept the conditions, so they departed. So it's the West that's not serious about peace. It never was. It was all political performance. And I believe that Putin comprehends this, and that his offer, is both genuine, but also, it exposes the deception for what it is. Look, clears throat every Russian I converse with, and I had some very substantial interviews in the recent couple days. They state sanctions have impact. There's no question about it. I mean, it's not the standard way of conducting business, but Russia has adjusted to them, and the Russian economy continues to expand. Right now, it maintains a growth rate of 4.8%. What's the American growth rate? 1.6, 1.8. So, Russia's economy is performing far superior to the American economy when it comes to growth. They needed to make modifications, and they continue to need to make modifications. No economy realistically desires to transition into war production, because that's just not the method to make economies flourish. And Russia's needed to transition into a war production with its defense sector. So that creates excess heat in the economy. It contributes to inflationary patterns. All of this is affecting the Russian economy. But the daily existence of the Russians is of a very high standard. It's a stable economy, a stable existence. There's no fuel shortages. Food prices are normal. Yes, there's inflation. There's no question about that. That's caused by the economic effects of sanctions. But the notion that sanctions are strangling Russia is ridiculous. The sanctions are strangling Europe. And if Donald Trump continues this foolishness, he's going to discover that the world isn't going to accept his threats, his intimidation, and it'll be the United States that's isolated, not Russia. Well, the narrative circulating is very direct. Lavrov has been criticized for being somewhat undiplomatic in his phone conversation with Marco Rubio, essentially establishing the terms and causing Rubio to, not only end the conversation, but withdraw from Budapest. And, there was speculation that, Lavrov was being removed because of this. But no, the Kremlin has emerged and stated they have complete trust and confidence in Lavrov. Lavrov's, back out there delivering the same statements. The reality is, I believe there was a movement within the Kremlin that wanted to maintain faith in the Alaska momentum and wanted to believe, and some possibility still existed. But the reality is the Trump administration just isn't genuine about peace with Russia at this moment in time. You observe that with Donald Trump's statement. You observe that with everything Marco Rubio states. And the point I emphasize repeatedly, there's only one route to peace with the United States between Russia and the United States, and that's 100% complete Russian victory in Ukraine. Until that occurs, Trump will be, constrained by his own legacy. Marco Rubio by his own animosity. Russia needs to eliminate the possibility of Ukraine being an instrument that can be utilized to undermine Russia once and for all with a conclusive military victory. And that's the general strategy that Russia's pursuing. I mean, I cannot speak on behalf of Vladimir Putin or attempt to. But every Russian I've conversed with concurs that not only is that what's required, but that's the trajectory Russia's following. Well, one of the primary reasons is because Marco Rubio terminated all of our arms control experts back in July. 1,300 State Department personnel, many of whom were working in the arms bureaus or the bureaus managing Russia, are eliminated. We don't have anyone in America that is qualified for thinking about arms control right now. There's no genuine effort on the part of the United States to proceed. Two, you know, the United States is very anxious about China right now because we demonstrated our capabilities in and around Taiwan, and issued not so subtle implications that if there was a conflict with Taiwan, it could become nuclear. China responded, okay, if you desire to go nuclear, then let's go nuclear. We're going to cease our moderate scale nuclear arsenal, that was at 200, and we're going to modernize this, expand the quantity of missiles, expand the quantity of weapons today, 5 to 700, weapons expanding to exceed 1,000 by 2030. This new start limit is 1,550, but Russia has 1,550 now. If China has 1,000, that positions the United States behind. And so the foolishness of American strategy, combined with the fact that we don't have any capability to participate in arms control, has resulted in a situation where the United States finds itself at a strategic disadvantage. And so there's substantial pressure being applied on the president to wait, when this treaty expires, to proceed and immediately begin to, expand the quantity of warheads positioned on Minuteman III that provides us significant options and things of that nature. Well, they are, if your priorities are long-term peace or arms control. But this administration's priorities aren't long-term peace, and it isn't arms control. The Trump administration has adopted this philosophy of peace through strength. But that requires you have to be strong. And, being strong is one thing. If you're, Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Donald Trump isn't the speak softly type. His strength derives from his verbal diarrhea, where he demonstrates muscles that he no longer possesses. I mean, this is a man who, has developed a cult of personality. People surrounding him admire everything he states and regard it as if it's the gospel. But his statements are so far detached from reality, it's not amusing. But Marco Rubio arrived and was instructed to reduce the State Department. He examined, skill sets that weren't going to be required under the Trump administration, and he eliminated them. Again, just relying on the news accounts. Israel utilized an incident that supposedly occurred in Rafah, a location where Hamas states they have no presence. Somebody supposedly fired upon an Israeli soldier, and they utilized this as a pretext to initiate, an aerial bombardment on civilian locations in Gaza, killing, again, according to accounts, 100 children. And now Israel states that it has ceased and it will once again, honor the ceasefire. But I believe this is a calculated maneuver on the part of Israel to transmit a signal that they are the permanent occupying force, that even under ceasefire circumstances, Israel maintains the authority to attack anytime, any location, against anyone, without any concern of repercussions. Well, I don't believe that Netanyahu requested permission. I believe Netanyahu notified Donald Trump based upon pre-established agreements that were established. Clears throat that if Hamas, violated in accordance with Israeli interpretations of violation any element of this agreement, that Israel maintained the authority to attack. And so I believe that Netanyahu simply informed Trump that Hamas committed this and we will be attacking. He doesn't desire Trump to be caught by surprise while on an international trip, because Trump has a tendency when caught by surprise to express things spontaneously. And I believe Israel is very focused on narrative management here. But the notion that Netanyahu requested Trump for permission, I don't accept that. I don't believe they've rearmed. I believe they've continued to maintain their weapons. They haven't surrendered arms. To rearm would necessitate, external providers, utilizing established, supply routes. I don't believe Hamas would jeopardize the ceasefire, executing the type of reckless action. I believe Hamas has sufficient weaponry to protect itself and to execute operations if required to do so. But I do believe that Hamas is committed about this ceasefire agreement, would prefer to see it proceed. So I don't believe that they're actively attempting to obtain weaponry from external sources, because that just generates the opportunity to provide the Israelis on a silver platter what they desire, pretext to attack. The response is yes. We understand this because Israel initiated their celebrated, final offensive in Gaza that rapidly became stalled. That's why we have a ceasefire agreement today, because Israel attempted to eliminate Hamas and failed. Hamas continued to fight and was eliminating Israeli soldiers on a daily basis. And so should Israel decide to, re-engage Hamas, I believe Hamas has the capability to continue to fight as effectively as they have in the past. Was the Wittitov, Kushner-Trump Gaza plan just a deception to secure the Israeli hostages home from the right-wing Israeli viewpoint? Oh, there's no question about it. Ben-Gvir has declared so that we secured our hostages home. They stated now it's the moment to proceed and complete the operation. So clearly, from the viewpoint of the right-wing political faction in Israel that support Benjamin Netanyahu, that there was no genuine intention of an actual ceasefire. They have no intention of permitting the circumstances to materialize that could result in a Palestinian state. They desire to eliminate Hamas permanently, but they had a massive political crisis, which was the hostages. This was generating massive political upheaval in Israel. So they believe that they have resolved this issue, and now they would prefer to proceed and complete what they initiated, which is the total elimination of Hamas, was always a deception. And for the Trump-Kushner-Wittitov triumvirate to claim otherwise is ridiculous. Now, the question is, if you understand that they believe it's a deception, what are you, the United States, these three, prepared to do to guarantee that it isn't a deception? Because if you don't have a strategy established to counter the intentions of Israel, then you're complicit in the deception. Of course, he's engaging in word games. I mean, how else do you account for the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, arriving in Israel only to have the Knesset at the Israeli parliament vote in support of the annexation? Laughter mean they're not even concealing it. They essentially waited until the number 2 official in America arrived in Israel and stated, hey, we're voting in support of annexation. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu emerged and stated, I cannot control the parliament. It's like your Congress. No, he can. And this vote occurred. And it was a message from the Israelis to the United States that we're going to do whatever we desire to do, regardless of what you believe. And this was a meeting that originated at the request of the Trump administration. The Russians were more than willing to participate in this meeting. Snorts, the United States withdrew when it became evident that the Russians had no intention of capitulating to the United States' demands. The Russian position concerning Ukraine's ceasefire, conclusion of conflict, are quite transparent and haven't changed, unlike the American position, which fluctuates constantly. But now what's occurred is because the Trump administration, attempted to blame the Russians for this, the Russians have responded with some very severe language. In summary, there will be no meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump until the United States satisfies certain conditions, some of which have been stated: rescinding Executive Order 14,024 and the associated sanctions, rescinding the legislation that was enacted by Congress designating Russia as a, terrorist sponsoring nation, acknowledging reality in Eastern Ukraine. There's other conditions that haven't been stated, but what this indicates is that it's not simply the United States can arrange a meeting between presidents. Those times are finished. And the concept of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump convening for a get acquainted meeting, no business to be conducted. We're just going to converse. Those times are over. I'll remind you that just a few days ago, Vladimir Putin presented to the Russian National Security Council a brand new nuclear strategy that was subsequently endorsed by the Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament. It's not a doctrine, so it doesn't require presidential signature, but it establishes clear parameters where Russia regards itself as confronting an existential threat, which would initiate the use of nuclear weapons. And foremost amongst these threats is the utilization of long-range attacks by a third-party non-nuclear nation, such as Ukraine, with the weapons supplied by a nuclear nation against territory that Russia regards to be its national territory. Now, this encompasses parts of Ukraine that Russia has legally incorporated into Russia in accordance with international law. So if long-range attacks are utilized against this territory, this is a catalyst for the utilization of a nuclear response. One, let me just state, if you were a genuine American, you should be embarrassed that we are responsible for a strategy that is, that enables a nuclear war, that we're advocating for a nuclear war, and the reckless language of NATO, the reckless rhetoric of Donald Trump these days. The concept that America, which used to be a symbol of stability, a symbol of peace. I mean, yes, we were flawed as a nation, and yet we were the one declaring we don't desire to go to war. We don't desire World War III. We desire to do everything conceivable to prevent World War III. Now, we are the ones advocating for World War III, and this should be a national humiliation. But let's return to the question about how serious is Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat. It is so lethally serious, people cannot grasp it. People need to comprehend that. Examine the nuclear triad, correct? Our intercontinental ballistic missiles, 400 Minutemen dispersed in fortified silos in Idaho, in Montana, Wyoming, and in North Dakota. And we maintain these ICBMs as the number one component of our nuclear triad. This fulfills a crucial mission in that it represents the ultimate nuclear absorber. The Russians desire to attempt to launch a first strike against the United States. They must expend a substantial number of their missiles eliminating these targets. These missiles are fortified. They require 2 warheads at the absolute minimum to eliminate. They're distributed all over. So you must utilize hundreds of weapons to eliminate that strategic target. That's our primary deterrent against first strike. However, one the Russians are utilizing as the weapon of retaliation. It is ineffective as a deterrent. Russia just demonstrated to the world just exactly how ineffective it is as a deterrent when they initiated a strike against the facility in Dnipro, utilizing the response. The United States' response to this wasn't to state, well, that's interesting, and withdraw. The United States' response was to escalate. This is an indication that we are not deterred by this system, which indicates the whole escalate to deter logic is ridiculous.